So I'm going to be talking about non-metal toxic chemicals in human disease. And as a laboratory-oriented biochemist, I thought that the lack of good testing was greatly inhibiting the use of testing for both diagnosis and treatment for most of the world's chemicals. So the situation is that there were like a separate test for these hundreds of different chemicals, but the difficulty is the patient would go broke if they wanted to screen for a large number. And in the field of metals testing, we had appropriate testing available, and so there's tens of thousands of articles about the effects of various toxic metals on health, but very little on the non-metals. And I didn't think it was because the non-metals were so much safer. It was really just not having appropriate testing at a fair price, a decent price, and being able to screen multiple chemicals simultaneously. I thought that really was needed, and so that was our project for the last 8 years. So the new test is called the GPL tox. It uses urine, so it's very easy to collect, and it screens for 168 toxic chemicals. And this is still undergoing development, so we'll be doubling the scope of it, and over the next months. Includes 151 organophosphate pesticides, plasticizers such as phthalates and styrene. It includes 6 different pyrethroid insecticides, vinyl chloride, which is can be a factor anytime vinyl plastics are used, because when vinyl chloride is converted to plastics, much of the vinyl chloride becomes a polymer, which isn't toxic at all because it's solid, it stays in the plastic. But invariably, some of the vinyl chloride is still free. And so if you're drinking from a plastic cup, or your kitchen floor is made of vinyl, with wear and tear, the free vinyl will escape, and you'll be exposed to it. It includes the solvents benzene and xylene, and 2,4-D, which is one of the world's most common weed killers. It's commonly used on people's lawns and municipal parks, and it's now being used in a large number of GMO foods, to where, if Monsanto and its allies have their way, virtually all our foods will be contaminated with 2,4-D. The whole name is 2,4-dichlorophenoxy acetic acid. And already we've seen that there's extensive contamination, and not on people sprayers. We haven't even tested on the general population, who didn't think they had any exposure, had tremendous quantities in their biological fluids. MTBE and ETBE are commonly used as a gasoline additive. When lead was taken out of the gasoline, the chemical companies do what they always do. They put in a new compound that's untested. So nobody can say this is bad because it's brand new. So you can't have people rallying and saying take this out, because it takes a period of time to assess toxicity. And the problem with these 2 different chemicals that are closely chemically related is they're extremely water soluble. So if you have these gas tanks, and I'm talking about your plain ordinary gas station where you bring your car, invariably they're made out of some steel or iron product that begins to rust after a period of time in the ground, and they spring leaks. Well, the ordinary chemicals in gasoline pretty much stay near where the leak is, where the MTBE and ETBE spread. And if there's underground aquifers, it dissolves right in the aquifer. And so some cities in the United States, virtually the entire municipal water supply was contaminated with this. And the other thing, I thought it would be really nice if we had a clinical marker for how this affected the individual. So not only did they have this, but was it affecting them clinically? And one of the best markers I found was a chemical called glycine, which is a marker for mitochondria damage. And so virtually all of these different chemicals affect mitochondrial function. So with this test, if the person has elevated glycine, it will also indicate the severity of their mitochondrial damage as well. So toxic chemicals are everywhere. Some of the more common are the insecticides, the weed killers, and the two big weed killers are called the 2,4-D and the glyphosate. And they've now been combined in a single product called Enlist Duo. And already many of the crops, such as wheat and soy, have been genetically modified to resist this. And so one of the things you need to be aware of is the chemical companies making these want to say these people are being so unreasonable just because that we've been changing genes all the time, through artificial selection, just by, if you take the potato that's the biggest in the crop and you use it for producing new potatoes, that's a form of selection. So how is GMO any different? In a way, that's true, but the thing is, it's not the fact that with the GMO, you're changing some of the DNA so that there are new amino acids to which people aren't exposed. Presumably, it could cause harm because there might be new allergies that came up, but the bigger problem is not that just the change in the amino acid sequence of new proteins. The big problem is the exposure to the toxic chemicals, because what happens is weeds become resistant to these herbicides, and as a result, the person the following year might have to use twice as much, which means that this genetically modified food materials that are resistant to this will have more and more of the toxic chemical inside the food as the fields are doused with this stuff. So solvents, cleaning agents, soap. So virtually all of the antibacterial soaps are extremely toxic to humans. In my opinion, they should all be eliminated from use. The plastics I mentioned with the vinyl chloride, carpets, drapes, and clothes may have flame retardants. That's another chemical that will be added in the near future to the Great Plains GPL tox. The germicides, all the hexachlorophene and PCMX that are in the antibacterial soaps are also very toxic to humans and animals. Packaging materials may have phthalates. Drugs may be absolutely loaded with phthalates. Phthalates are used to induce the time-release properties. So many time-release drugs, the time-release agent is the phthalates itself. The plants, of course, can be contaminated with both insecticides and herbicides, the food, the water. It's found that in areas where the herbicide glyphosate is used, that it's gone extensively, it vaporizes extensively, so when it's raining glyphosate. So even people who have organic farms not using this, if they're getting their rain from the sky is raining glyphosate down on their organic farm. So the air industry, rat killers, and fungicides, all of these are sources of toxic chemicals. And for the most part, we're measuring the metabolite because that's the most convenient thing. So most of the chemicals have a metabolite that is specific for the particular chemical and can be easily measured in urine. So the consideration was that urine is one of the best body fluids for measuring because most of these toxic chemicals are present in much higher concentrations in the urine. So if the person's been exposed to them, it will be easier to detect them in urine. So xylene's converted to toluic acid, which then combines with glycine. That's what is called a phase 2 detoxification reaction, which makes it more water soluble so it can be excreted. So the methyl hippuric acid is specific for xylene. Pyrethrins are very common insecticide. They were first brought on because there were so many deaths associated with organophosphates, and we're looking for new products that might be less toxic. So the terms, I wanted to go over those. Pyrethrum is the crude extract from the flower. The chrysanthemum flower been used by the Chinese for thousands of years as an insecticide. The name pyrethrin is the name for 6 different insecticidal chemicals that can be purified from the flower extract. And pyrethroids, which are now most commonly used as insecticides, are synthetic chemicals in which there's been really extensive chemical modification of the naturally occurring chemical structure, and they're much more toxic than pyrethrins and to humans as well. But even the flower had some toxicity to humans. So in recent years, there's been a lot of studies indicating that even though they may be safer than organophosphates, they may still have extensive neurotoxicity. And so a lot of studies have been looking at them in involvement in multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease and in neuropathy and in heart disease as well. And it's also found that these chemicals cause immune depression. So the candida, the common candida overgrowth is classically was known to occur with exposure to broad spectrum antibiotics, which killed the normal flora, allowing candida to accelerate. But there's now extensive studies that many of the toxic chemicals to which we're exposed also depress immunity and allow for candida proliferation. So the heavy metals, the diesel fuel from airplanes, and now the pyrethrin insecticides. They also cause fertility problems, clotting problems, and suspected blood diseases in children. And we can detect a number of these because we look at a common metabolite. So permethrin, cypermethrin, and deltamethrin, and actually 3 other pyrethroid chemicals are all converted to a common metabolite. So one of the things we look for is, can we test for a single substance that will allow us to screen for multiple different chemicals. So the toxicity, this is from a government agency that regulates toxicity, list all the side effects. So some are minor, but then you get into muscle twitching, reduced energy, changing in awareness, loss of consciousness, incoordination, tremors, convulsions, and death is, I would consider, a fairly serious side effect. And there's been association both with autism and attention deficit. So the pet shampoos frequently have an additional chemical, and this particular one is very common, called piperonyl butoxide. And the function of this is to inhibit the cytochrome P450 of the insect, so that the insect will, metabolism system will be overwhelmed and will be more likely to die when exposed to these. The problem is this inhibitor of insect P450 also inhibits animal and human P450. And so it also makes these pet shampoos more toxic to the human in addition to the insect. So a study reported in California that mothers exposed to pet shampoos, and virtually all of these were pyrethroid-based shampoos, were twice as likely to have a child with autism, and the second trimester was the worst time for exposure in increasing autism incidence. And the same thing with attention deficit with hyperactivity. They use data from the NHANES. So this is interesting to me because this was my first job when I got out of graduate school. This is a group that it's called, the full name is National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So this is an ongoing study of the nutritional factors in the American public. So it's a branch of the Center for Disease Control, and they send these caravans out all throughout the United States to get a representative sampling of nutritional substances as well as toxic exposure. And children who had the pyrethroid compound above the limit of detection were twice as likely to have ADHD than compared to those who were below the limit of detection. And the hyperactive impulsive symptoms increased by 50% for every tenfold increase in the pyrethroids. And what was interesting is this was affecting primarily boys, so girls were not affected. So it seems like for a lot of things, boys are more susceptible. There are many more times, there's 4 or 5 times as many boys with autism, and pretty much the same values for sex ratio for ADD and ADHD as well. So some of this is due to boys having greater susceptibility to toxic chemicals. So pesticides are frequently sprayed through the air. I talked to a naturopathic physician in the United States whose husband has an organic farm. The problem is all the farms around are not organic, and so when you take sprays like this, the wind can take them and blow it past the boundary line onto their farm. And she said her husband would frequently come in if he was out plowing, and at night his skin would excrete huge amounts of these toxins. The bed sheets were all just completely covered with a yellow goo after he was out, even though he was an organic farmer. So even organic food is contaminated frequently because the wind respects no boundaries. So the organophosphates can be tested by looking at two particular metabolites, the dimethyl-phosphate. So there's about 70 of the organophosphates that are converted to this metabolite. And this is the list. And when you get the test report, you get the entire list of which chemicals are screened with which metabolite. And also this other metabolite, there's about another 70 that are converted to diethyl phosphate, including this one. This one is somewhat more toxic because it, in addition to being an organophosphate, it's an organochlorine as well. So it has 1, 2, 3 chlorine atoms as well, which makes it more toxic. So this is the 77 different organophosphates that are used worldwide convert to DEP metabolite, which is what we measure. In Mexico, it was found that pesticide-exposed children had much less physical endurance to see how long they could keep jumping up and down. It was like, if you jump up and down for 15 minutes, we're going to give you a candy bar or something. So there was a reward. And in the region, there were, one was an agriculture region. So it was a mountain that had some mountainous areas with a valley in between. So there was almost no agriculture on people in the mountains because the land wasn't suitable for planting for agriculture. The flat valley on the bottom was very suitable. And the problem is, of course, it was extensively sprayed with pesticides. So they found the children who lived in the mountains could jump up and down forever without getting tired. The kids exposed to the pesticides in the valley had far less endurance, and it was found that those children exposed had inferior hand-eye coordination, and that most children exposed to pesticides weren't able to draw this simple stick man. They would just maybe sometimes draw a circle in one line, whereas the children not exposed could easily make that drawing. And they also had much more aggressive behavior, became upset or angry with minor comments by the parents. And again, this didn't occur in the mountain children who weren't exposed to pesticides. So I really think, you may have, I'm sure you heard on the news, the person who killed a bunch of people in a church in Charleston. And when one thing that a lot of people made very little comment about was just before that episode, he was working on applying organophosphate pesticides. So, and when they talked about his history, they said he had many friends who were black when he was younger. So I don't know absolutely for sure, but I would suspect that the exposure to the pesticides may have contributed to this abnormal behavior. In the Central Valley in California is the source of a lot of food for the entire United States. It's an extremely fertile area that has a very long growing season. And of course, pesticides are widely used here, and they found that children exposed to pesticides, a 7-fold increase in the autism rate, and the mothers in this region had shorter pregnancies, and their children frequently had impaired reflexes. And in this study, in a similar study in Virginia, they found that children had poor scores on this psychomotor development index. So these are measures of the development of the children, and the children were much more likely to have attention deficit and disorder problems, and pervasive developmental disorder is a term that's used for like mild autism. And so the children in the high exposure group had much poorer scores on development. And this not only applies to children, it applies to adults. This was a study from Brazil, finding that of course, the workers who apply these things are much more likely. So one of the most common things was generalized anxiety disorder on the individuals who were spraying this stuff, but also some had panic disorder, anxiety, obsessive compulsive, increased suicide risk, manic. So, quite a variety of abnormal psychiatric symptoms when exposed to this. And so one of the reasons, the question is, why are there some people in the population that are more susceptible? And this helps to explain it, that children with autism have very low rates of the enzyme called paraoxidase, which is the enzyme that breaks down the organophosphate insecticides. So the value was about half that found in normal individuals. So the individual who has low amounts of this enzyme will be much more susceptible to damage from organophosphates. And so one of the questions after working on this project for 8 years was, am I going to find anything or not? Are people going to uncover things? And it just took a very short period of time, and we started seeing results. So this was a 2-year-old with autism, so a 2-year-old you don't think is out spraying the fields or anything like that. You think that person should be safe, but that was not the case. So they had a very high level of the vinyl chloride metabolite, and the study had been published finding that people who had vinyl floors were much more likely to have children with autism in Scandinavia. That was like, there were 2 big risk factors. One was vinyl floors, the other was parental smoking. This is the benzene metabolite. Well, this is okay. This is at the limit of quantitation, but the vinyl chloride metabolite is extremely high. So it would double the 95th percentile. In addition, the child had extremely high organophosphate metabolite. You can, again, well above the upper limit of normal. And if you looked at the mitochondrial marker, it was extremely abnormal. So a number of studies have associated mitochondrial damage with autism, but what is causing the mitochondrial damage? After having this test available for only a short time, it looks like these toxic chemicals in our environment, the non-metal toxic chemicals, are a major reason. So the upper limit of normal being 11, the child's value of 40, which indicates severe mitochondrial damage. So this shows the breakdown of organophosphates using the paraoxidase, but the paraoxidase is also involved with the detoxification of homocysteine. So homocysteine can be converted to a form called homocysteine thiolactone, which is extremely toxic and carcinogenic. If the person, so the PON helps to convert the more toxic form of homocysteine back to ordinary homocysteine, but if the person has high amounts of organophosphate, the enzyme is overloaded So it's getting more than it can deal with, and as a consequence, either the organophosphates don't break down as well, or the homocysteine detoxification pathway doesn't work as well. And it's also involved in this methylation cycle. Many of you may have seen this or used some of the markers like MTHFR. Well, the PON is also involved in this, and the one of the enzymes involved in homocysteine metabolism, which is affected by folate, B6, B12. So another study looked at the air and the incidence of autism, and they found that when the air had high amounts of mercury, cadmium, nickel, trichloroethylene, or vinyl chloride, the one that the 2-year-old had high values of, there was an increased rate of autism in neighborhoods that had those chemicals high in the air. And they've also found that these common things that are used on people's lawns could cause difficulty with the development of animals. So this was a study in which animals were exposed to different amounts of pesticides, and the development of the embryo was observed. And of course they found that if you combine these, the toxicity is even greater. And so, so 3 of these chemicals that lead to fetal malformation are included in the GPL tox test. So if these things were mixed together, they became, the toxicity to the embryos became much greater. So plastics, this became famous in a very popular movie. One of the made Dustin Hoffman the star, the movie The Graduate, where he's just coming of age, and one of his parents' friends takes him aside and is like, he's going to tell him the secrets of the universe. And he says, there's something you need to know as you go out in the world. And he whispers in his ear, plastics, that's where you need to put all your effort. So plastics have been very useful. Unfortunately, they're loaded with toxic chemicals. So, and one of the most toxic is the phthalates. So the phthalates are in almost everything. So, and they're toxic in many ways. And these are all confirmed studies. Abnormal sexual development in boys, and they've confirmed that with animal studies and in humans. It's probably a major cause of why girls have puberty much earlier than in the past. It may cause the increase in neurotoxic quinolinic acid. It's been found that men who use aftershave products that are high in phthalates have lower sperm counts and reduced sexual function. Been a number of studies showing relations to cancer, autoimmunity, and weight gain as well. So this is a person with who's an artist with extreme fatigue, and her value for one of the most common phthalates is, you can see the 95th percentile is 850, say round off to 1,000. So her value is about 20 times the upper population value for phthalates. And the phthalates are also associated with autism. So far, a lot of these chemicals are autism associated. So this shows the autism spectrum disorder, much higher values than in the controls. Styrene is another thing that is can occur everywhere, and again, it can be due to outgassing. It can be in automobile exhaust, but it can be virtually anywhere. And again, it is carcinogenic, nausea, headache, fatigue, leukopenia, and leukocytosis, CNS depression. So I think an easy thing to remember is any chemical that is toxic enough to cause death is likely also a source of a chemical that could cause psychiatric and neurologic symptoms, because the brain is the most metabolically active organ in the body. The only exception might be a marathon runner who's really putting his muscles to the test, but but the brain is in many people in our society is really working very hard in our intellectual jobs that put a lot of work on the brain. So the styrofoam cups used for coffee, there's just like there's free vinyl in the vinyl chloride, there's free styrene in all the styrofoam containers. And so if you put hot coffee or an acid drink like lemonade or alcohol drink like wine, and then if you weigh the cup, and then you weigh the cup with the liquid, and then pour out the liquid after letting it be in contact with the styrene, the cup will weigh less. After drying the cup, removing all the liquid, the cup will weigh less because a lot of the weight of the cup has dissolved in the liquid, of which of course you're drinking when you use a styrofoam cup. And the styrene is broken down to form phenylglyoxylic acid, which is what we measure in the GPL tox. And this is the study showing the association of the vinyl chloride. So floors of polyvinyl chloride are associated with high air phthalates, but I don't think they mentioned that it's also going to be high in vinyl chloride as well. Benzene can cause a variety of symptoms from cardiac, headaches, tremors, confusion, unconsciousness, vomiting, sleepiness, convulsions, and death at high amounts. Benzene is converted by a series of reactions to form phenylmercapturic acid, which is what we measure in the GPL tox. Benzene, of course, anytime you pump gas, there's usually warnings at the gas pump not to get too close because it's carcinogenic. And in addition, there's some natural sources like volcanoes and forest fires or regular fires in the city, but it's widely used throughout. And this is the big problem with this is the underwater tank at your friendly gas station. And the big problem is that invariably after a period of years they'll have leaks, and if it has the MTBE in it, that chemical will dissolve in the aquifers and eliminate and intoxicate the entire population. That one of the big cities, beach cities in Southern California, the entire water supply was contaminated because of this type of leak. And the two chemicals, ETBE and MTBE, are both converted to the same compound, hydroxyisobutyric acid. And this is really common in people living in downtown Kansas City. I asked the water department when was the last time they've tested their water for these chemicals, and so far I've received no response. So they may not be too happy about saying that the Kansas City water is contaminated. So this is a 3-year-old boy, and you see he has extremely high values of the MTBE metabolite. And in addition, he has gigantic values for the 2,4-D, the herbicide. And what's amazing is that some of these people say, you know, gee, I eat organic food and I don't spray my lawn with this stuff. But the problem is, if your neighbors do, again, these chemicals don't respect any your property line, so you can easily be contaminated even though you don't use it yourself. So this is showing that same 3-year-old, and what it showed is that he had extremely high values of succinic acid. So the upper limit of normal was 23. He had a value of 265, indicating severe mitochondrial dysfunction. And he also had extremely high oxalates. And so I suspect that I've seen a lot of this abnormality, and I'm beginning to think this may be related to the toxic exposure. And now I want to get into the glyphosate, one of the most common weed killers, and potentially one of the most toxic chemicals there is, because it's such a small molecule, it can volatilize and go into the air and go into the rain. And so the people have glyphosate raining down on them, even if they're healthy farmers. So in March of this year, WHO said it's classified as a probable carcinogen in humans based on epidemiologic animal studies and in vitro studies. And these were rats exposed. You can see this is with the GMO food. These were rats who were exposed to, so the GMO foods contain glyphosate. This was exposure with R, which is Roundup, which is the biggest seller of glyphosate. And this was a combination of glyphosate and the GMO foods. So what happened is Monsanto, when they first brought the product out, only tested for about 3 months. And what these individuals did was test for up to 2 years. And they found that with the longer exposure, there was a much bigger increase in the rate of tumors in both mammary tumors in the female rats and prostate tumors in the male rats. And this article was very famous because after it was published, Monsanto sent a big delegation to the publisher and demanded that it be retracted. And nobody knows exactly what happened, what the conversation, but it was along the lines of, we can't be absolutely certain that this was the cause of the cancer. And so as a result of this complaint, they withdrew the article. So he just went around and went to another journal, and it says the republication of the article. And he was saying, why should there be like a standard for perfect. Science doesn't work that way. Science can say there's a increased probability, increased rate, but we can't, we can't typically say with one experiment, yes, this definitely causes cancer, although when I look at this, I think it's pretty definitive that the product is not safe. But in any case, they were requiring a higher standard for scientific publication than had ever been applied for any other study. And they had put different disclaimers in there saying, further work needs to be done and things like that. And I personally think it was just the politics, and you hate to think that money may have been involved, but there's suspicions. So the article, the republished study, feeding the animals the genetically modified corn, and it's not, again, almost everybody in the general public thinks the people who are against this are weirdos who think that just because the corn has been modified. So anytime you see this, you need to correct people. It's not, we're not worried about a few amino acids being changed in the corn. We're worried about the corn being saturated with the 2,4-D and the glyphosate and those chemicals causing harm. So the females exposed to either the glyphosate or the corn containing glyphosate had many more mammary tumors. The pituitary was the second most, and the sex hormone balance was also altered. Males also had 4 times more tumors than the control group. And one of the countries most affected is Argentina, Argentina has had a tough time with its economy, so the government decided what they were going to do is their land had a climate that was really good for growing soy, and so they've converted the majority of agriculture there into using genetically modified soy, which is then exported to Europe. So even though Europe has laws that prevent the use of glyphosate on the crops in Europe, the stuff of all your animals in Europe are contaminated with this glyphosate, the soy saturated with glyphosate, and the local people are really suffering with a big increase in birth defects and cancer. More than 300 million liters of this pesticide are sprayed. The neonatal specialist in this region of Argentina says, I see newborn infants, many of whom are malformed. I have to tell parents that their children are dying because of these agricultural methods. In some areas of Argentina, the primary cause of death for children less than 1 is malformations. In Malvinas, which is surrounded by these GMO plantations, the rate of miscarriage is 100 times the national average, courtesy of glyphosate. So this is from the physician, his quote. And just like the pyrethroid that had an additive that made it more toxic, the same is true of the Roundup. They add this thing called POEA, polyethoxylated toluamine, and it is also very toxic. So that adds to the toxicity of glyphosate. And in some cases, the additive is more toxic than the glyphosate itself. So this particular journal went through about 25 different diseases and found a very high correlation between increased incidence of chronic diseases of every type and the increase in glyphosate. And this is autism. So the red is the amount of glyphosate that's applied to corn and soy, the main two GMO crops, although they're adding new ones all the time. And the yellow bars are the increase in the rate of autism. And you can see this is probably one of the most, I've seen a number of association graphs, but this is probably one of the most compelling. The correlation coefficient is almost 0.99 between the use of the glyphosate and the rate of autism increase. So the thioglycine is included in the GPL tox so that it can measure the respiratory chain activity in the mitochondria. A high value indicates poor mitochondrial function. And this is the structure. It again is a conjugate of glycine, so many molecules in the body are detoxified by being attached to glycine and tiglic acids that forms thioglycine. And it affects the respiratory complexes in the mitochondrial membrane. And then this is the biochemical pathway by which it works. The critical thing is right here. At this stage, the mitochondria convert NADH to NAD. So if the mitochondria are damaged by toxic chemicals, NAD is not produced and you have an excess of NADH. With the excess of NADH, the biochemical pathway goes back this way instead of going, continuing on and eventually converting these byproducts to succinyl-CoA. So this biochemical pathway in a person with good mitochondrial function goes this way and around here, but if there's a foul up in the mitochondria, the NADH builds up and the reaction is reversed, forming high amounts of thioglycine. So if that's broken, then the NADH increases and the biochemical pathway reverses to form T-glyl-CoA and then thioglycine, which continues to increase. So the amount of the thioglycine is a indirect measurement of the mitochondrial respiratory chain. So it was just lucky for us that, you know, one of the big challenges in the test was being able to resolve. I mean, the urine is full of thousands of chemicals, and so we had to have a marker that was resolved chromatographically in the test, and thioglycine was a good marker that could be measured along with the other toxic chemicals. So the question is, how do you detoxify if you're exposed? So the first thing, make sure you use the non-GMO organic food. Exercise frequently to the point of sweating because that helps to release many of the toxic chemicals. If you're sweating, be sure to remove your sweat, because if you don't, if you just cool off with all the sweat, all that stuff is going to be absorbed back inside your skin, and you're not going to be better off. So bring a towel, and of course make sure you launder that towel frequently because it's going to be contaminated with all your toxic chemicals. Sauna is very helpful. It's found that any type of sauna works best. Some people like the far infrared because the The temperature doesn't have to be as high, but regular sauna does work. So whichever sauna you have, you want to induce sweating. The Hubbard protocol is the thing that was somewhat unique about was adding niacin. So the flushing reaction helps to mobilize some of the toxins in the fat up to the skin. So unfortunately, it's the type that causes flushing. So you have to be able to tolerate that flushing reaction, and the doses are pretty high. So this was a political move in the United States, but this is kind of a bizarre thing. And so I want to just say, you know, this was developed by the Scientology person, and I want to make a disclaimer. I don't have anything to do with Scientology. I think there are you know, some very weird things, but just like many weird people have weird ideas, sometimes they have good ideas, and this appears to be one of it. And so they did the treatment for free for all the workers at the World Trade Center who were exposed to thousands of chemicals when those Twin Towers blew up. And a lot of those people were severely ill. And I talked to some of them personally, and they said this protocol worked extremely well, that some of them had extreme fatigue, extreme memory loss. I mean, every kind of symptom. And they said after using the protocol, which is basically just the use of niacin and sauna treatment, but this is not a little bit. This is usually between 1 to 2 months, doing 1 to 2 hours every single day. And they have graphs showing marked reduction in a variety of toxins, whole body massages with vegetable oil. But of course, you need to discard that oil after use. The high doses of the B vitamins, especially folate, B6, B12, TMG, because this helps the methylation reaction and the PON enzyme to eliminate some of the pesticides, and also helping with the elimination of the toxic homocysteine thiolactone. Glutathione reacts with many toxic chemicals, so you can use either intravenous or oral. Studies, I just got a study that indicates that the liposomal glutathione is very well absorbed orally. Of course, purified water, the best being reverse osmosis. And another thing that I remembered from my toxicology days is that acidic drugs like phenobarbital can be removed much faster after an overdose by using alkalinization of the urine. So giving the person just sodium bicarbonate, what that does is virtually all of these drug metabolites have an acid group, but they can also exist one in which the hydrogen atom on the acid is lost, and when they're in that salt form, the body can eliminate them much faster. So the half-life, for example, for 2,4-D goes from 33 hours to something like 4 hours if you alkalinize the urine. So this would be a way of getting a really fast improvement, but you have to be careful because if you alkalinize to the point that the person could have respiratory alkalosis, and they would stop breathing. So you have to be careful. I would say monitor the blood pH, that would probably be the best thing. You want to make sure the blood pH doesn't get too high in doing it. But for short periods of time, I would think this would be an excellent way for detoxifying most of the toxic chemicals many of which either, for example, the 2,4-D is excreted as the parent compound, meaning you ingest 2,4-D, the body doesn't metabolize that, but you can get rid of it a lot faster by administering bicarbonate, say like a teaspoonful of bicarbonate. So summarizing the test again, 168 markers, all the organophosphates in the world, plasticizers, pyrethroid, insecticides, vinyl chloride, benzene, xylene, 2,4-D, MTBE. We tried to get glyphosate, but glyphosate had properties that wouldn't allow it to be tested by the mass spec. So we have that available as a enzyme immunoassay. If you order the glyphosate with that, there's like a $50 discount. So it's like $109 separately for the glyphosate because it's a very elaborate test that has to all be done manually. But only $59 if ordered with the GPL tox. And the GPL tox is also got a discount feature. If you order it with the organic acids, you get a big discount on the GPL tox. But the GPL tox for what you get is extremely valuable. If you had to do all 168 chemicals separately, your bill would probably be $10,000 or more if you tried to do. And that's why people didn't use this testing, because it would have required tons and tons of testing. And most people, when they have an exposure, they don't know which chemical it is, with the exception of somebody is spraying organophosphates out in the field and then all of a sudden has extreme sweating and diarrhea. You could figure out they probably organophosphates. But what was surprising to me were all the people who had extremely abnormal values, and none of them had any known, they weren't pesticide workers or agricultural workers or anything like that. And so just the general public is getting this, even in people who say they're being careful and eating organic. Some of these people still had very high values. So the GPL tox is using what is called the triple quad mass spec. So it's a mass spec of a mass spec, and that makes it extremely accurate and sensitive so that there's not interferences. And then the glyphosate is using the enzyme-linked immunoassay. So thank you.
Thank you for making this test available to us. It's very valuable. We've already been using it for patients. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So that was my big fear was, gee, after working on this for 8 years, we wouldn't find anything clinically relevant. So that fear has been erased in just, the first 2 weeks we started with it, we were seeing lots of significant abnormalities that, and the mitochondrial markers indicating that indeed they were very clinically relevant. Because if your mitochondria don't work, your whole body is not going to work, and especially your muscles and your brain, since they're the ones that need the highest amounts of energy. Yes?
What is the specificity or the sensitivity of your test of this GPL?
Well, I mean, it is the most sensitive test in the world.
Has it been rated in terms of?
I mean, we're measuring, in some cases, like parts per billion. So it's extremely sensitive and extremely accurate because we're taking a mass spectrum of a mass spectrum. So if you focus on a particular ion, that's characteristic of a molecule, then that particular ion can be further broken down, and so the chances of another molecule, you know, having exact characteristics of that are virtually, I mean, approaching zero. I don't want to say zero because maybe there's an exception, but an exception would be extremely unlikely. I mean, we're using essentially the same thing that the same method used by the Center for Disease Control in doing their population study, and we're actually using the reference values from the CDC National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, but we revalidated, we tested a large number of people to make sure we were getting comparable values, and we are. So I think it's going to be more and more valuable. I didn't have, this was a new case, so I didn't have it, but it was another child with severe autism, but even more severe. So in addition to all the autism things like not being able to talk and so forth, the child had difficulty swallowing, the child had difficulty crawling. You know, at 3 he was still unable to walk and things like that. So he had really severely impaired coordination, and with him the big thing was the 2,4-D, and yet the parents didn't have any idea where he could have gotten from. The parents live in Silicon Valley in California, so I don't know if it's due to maybe Google is spraying all their grass with 2,4-D or something. I don't know. So I get nervous when I see lawns that don't have any dandelions in it, because when you see nothing but grass, you can know that those people are spraying 2,4-D on their property. Canada has banned the use of 2,4-D for any municipal function, like the lawn of the court building or the playgrounds or the parks can't use 2,4-D. And I think that's a really good idea. So we've done real well on banning smoking. So I think that there'll be a fight, but that's really what it needs to be. I mean, it probably needs to be banned for everything, but I think at least starting with people's lawns and municipal properties and parks and where children are exposed. Yes, go ahead. You had a follow-up question?